Hello. Okay, cool. This is on. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Restorative Justice 101. Typically, with all of our restorative justice work, we start with a couple things, specifically a land acknowledgement and some kind of grounding. And so Vivianne and I are going to introduce ourselves in a moment beyond our names, but we wanted to start with both of those. So I would like to offer a land acknowledgement, and then I'll turn it over to Vivianne for a communal grounding. We are on unceded and unsurrendered territory, and if you are living in what is known as New York City, we are standing within Lenapehoking, or the land of the Lenape. This is the traditional land of the Lenni Lenape, the Canarsie, Munsee, Matinecock, Maspeth, and Rockaway nations. We commit to standing in solidarity with the Lenni Lenape and all indigenous nations in the ongoing struggle against settler colonialism. We invite all of us who are within this work to pay respect to the indigenous ancestors who are erased from the narrative of the United States, along with the African peoples and their descendants, and to take a moment to understand the many legacies of violence, displacement, and colonial settlement that brings us here today. We must understand that land back is central to indigenous liberation, just as we must understand that reparations and abolition is central to Black liberation, here to organize and witness liberation in our lifetime and for future generations.
Thank you. Everything that we do in our practice is also by invitation. So everything is an invitation and not a demand or a requirement. So with the breathing exercise that I'm going to guide us through, it's an invitation. You don't have to do it. You can close your eyes, you can leave your eyes open, you can sit with your eyes downcast. There's no requirement for the breathing exercise. And if you want to participate, just follow along with what I'm going to say. I'm going to close my eyes. So the first thing, this is a breathing exercise called Tonglen. And Tonglen is a way of connecting with suffering to find healing in ourselves and other people. So when you begin this practice, try to keep your body in a relaxed state, whatever a relaxed state means to you, whether that's feet on the ground or legs crossed, whatever is most comfortable for you. And the next thing I'll ask you to do is to rest your mind briefly. And you don't have to have a blank slate or clear your mind, just rest your mind. Take a pause and take a deep breath on your own. And this is a breathing exercise, but again, there's no requirement to breathe in any certain way. So if deep breathing helps to ground you, you can deep breathe. If breathing normally works for you, breathe normally. If you have some other practice of breathing that helps ground you, you can do that as well. And the first thing that I'll ask you to think about is a friend or someone you know who is in pain or is stuck or confused or is suffering in some way. And picture that person and their pain. And when you breathe in, imagine that you're breathing in that person's pain or stuckness or confusion. And when you breathe out, imagine that you're sending that person relief, relaxation, or clarity. And again, that's breathing in, imagining that you're taking in that person's pain or discomfort, and breathing out relief and clarity and relaxation. Just keep breathing, keeping that in mind. And the next thing I'll ask you to do is think about your own pain of any kind, whether it's physical pain or confusion or stuckness. And imagine when you're breathing in your own pain or stuckness, and when you're breathing out, you're sending yourself relief for that physical pain or mental confusion. And as an added vision, or if you're having trouble connecting with a loved one or yourself being in pain, if you can imagine working with texture, and imagine when you're breathing in, that you're breathing in a feeling of hot or heaviness or claustrophobia. And when you breathe out, you're breathing out coolness, calmness, and a sense of relief. Tonglen is a practice that can be extended infinitely. It can be for a loved one who you know to be in pain. It can be for yourself. It can be for general tension. It can also be done for people who you don't know. So if you can imagine others in the world who are suffering or in pain, imagine that you're breathing in those folks' pain. And when you breathe out, imagine you're sending out relief to all of those folks who you don't know, but who are in pain. You can even extend Tonglen out to people who you consider to be your adversaries or your enemies. Imagine that those people experience and are experiencing pain or stuckness of some kind. And when you breathe in, if you like, you can breathe in for those folks, for their stuckness and pain, and send them out relief. And just continue to breathe, breathing in for yourself and whomever else you wish to breathe in for, and breathe out for yourself and whomever you wish to breathe out for. And when you feel ready, we can come back together with our eyes open in the main space. Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing. So we're going to have two main halves of this workshop today. The first is going to be more around Vivianne and I kind of talking about restorative justice and storytelling around it. And the second half is going to be you all in small groups kind of working with different questions together. Just to be fully transparent, Vivianne and I, neither of us work specifically full-time in the context of supportive housing. We initially came to the digital version of this conference last year to really be able to talk about what is restorative justice, what are our experiences within it, and can we start imagining where different principles and parts of it might be able to tie to all of the work that you all are doing. So I just wanted to be transparent of who we are off the bat, and we can also start with a couple introductions. So my name's Anooj. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. I'm a restorative justice organizer, so if any of you are familiar with the organization Make the Road New York, I was their restorative justice coordinator for a handful of years before coming to Restorative Justice Initiative, where I'm now our coordinator for youth education and training programs. And so a lot of the work that I do is building a collaborative network across the city who are thinking of what restorative justice can look like across different sectors and kind of integrate it into how we see the larger New York City community. Outside of that, my academic background is in art, and I work mostly as a theater artist and doing a lot of art that is grounded in restorative practice of how do we think about art as a form of co-authorship, co-creation, something that is able to express needs of communities that are underneath what we visibly might mark as indicators of conflict or violence. So that's a little bit about me, and I will pass it to Vivianne for an introduction.
Hi, I'm Vivianne Guevara. I'm a social worker and I'm a public defender, and I've pretty much been a social worker and a public defender throughout my social work and public defense life. I started out at the Bronx Defenders in the Bronx, New York, and then I moved on to the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, and now I'm the director of social work at the Federal Defenders of New York in the Eastern District in Brooklyn. And I came to RJ, Restorative Justice, in my work as a public defender at the Federal Defenders of New York for a case, really thinking I would only be facilitating a circle for that case, and learned through facilitating how much healing I could get on my own for myself as also a survivor of violence, and continued to engage in restorative justice practices outside of work in the community and for various organizations and community members, and that's really where I started to grow my restorative justice practice. And it's grown into, one of my friends calls it a lifestyle and not just a practice. And so it really has helped me in my own life with moving through conflict with people and becoming less passive aggressive. And so I think it applies to many parts of our lives. And so I'm here to talk about that.
Nice. A couple questions. Can you all hear us?
Okay.
Okay. I guess my second question is, do you mind that if we're not on the mic and maybe come over here? I feel like when I'm talking on the mic, I like put all of myself right here rather than just like talking.
Oh,
do you feel?
Yeah, that's fine.
No,
If they can
not,
hear
that's
us.
not to obligate you to
Okay.
move there either.
Okay.
Wherever,
All right.
wherever you feel comfortable with
Okay,
the
I'll
question.
be right here.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I think really we want to start by giving kind of like an overall ideological framework around restorative justice work. And so to start off with that, we kind of wanted to mine from you all just what the understanding of restorative justice is in this space. And so what I would love to know, if something comes to your mind, are there definitions or terms or symbols or colors or people or places that come to your mind when you hear restorative justice? Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Restore.
Restore. And what does the word restore mean to you?
Make something better.
Okay, so to make something better, I heard the word change. Cool. Yeah.
Restore means to bring back to the state that it was in.
Cool. So to bring something back to the state that it was in.
Because it was broken.
Because it was broken. What else? Accountability, yes. Accountability is a regular word in my lexicon in restorative justice. Yeah.
When I think of restorative justice, I think of victims and perpetrators both being able to come together and find some sort of sense of balance and forgiveness within each other.
Amazing. So actually being able to bring people together on different sides of a conflict. The last words you said, forgiveness and
Balance.
balance. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
Shifting power dynamics, making sure that like it's evenly dispersed, or restoring someone's like onus or empowerment in something.
Awesome. So there's a ton of different, did you say the word onus?
Yeah.
Cool. So there's like a few different parts of that. This idea of shifting power dynamics. One of the things I always think of in restorative justice work is, can we imagine right here, right now, even for a moment, that like all of this hierarchy that we have to face day to day with each other just doesn't exist? Can we suspend that for just a moment, you know? Can we talk to each other while suspending that for just a moment? The idea of onus, which I think is really, it's really similar, it's like a word for me that stems around the accountability space as well. It's like, can you name the thing that happened? Can you name it? And then the third part is empowerment, right? And that for me is this like collective thing, this thing that we were able to create with and for each other. There's so much in that. Thank you. What else? Cool. So we have like kind of a mosaic definition of different ways that we regularly hear restorative justice being talked about. And so we want to kind of offer 4 different chunks of a larger definition, and then open it up to be like, what do you think about that? What's coming up for you? So this first part is that restorative justice, first and foremost, is an indigenous practice. The principles that form restorative justice today, a lot of them are taken from indigenous roots and indigenous practices. And that's in multiple ways. The first is that community building isn't only something you're supposed to do on the job with your coworkers. Community building is what we do to be able to coexist and live with one another in community day to day, right? And that understanding of community, it being how we treat each other because we are accountable to a world together, that extends outside of just sharing community and into ideas of accountability and conflict. And one of the reasons why I always try to ground restorative justice work in this larger definition that sits within indigenous practice is to say that in a lot of our workspaces, when it comes to constitutions, laws, rules of conduct, codes of conduct, conflict is named as a very specific thing, right? It's named as you do A, B, C thing, and D, E, F consequence happens to you. One of the things that I think is tough about that is it stops us from normalizing conflict. It says conflict is this thing, and you don't want to go near it because if you do, these things will happen to you, right? Or for those who have gone to it, we see you in these ways now. Rather than saying conflict is actually a really important part of any healthy ecosystem. It's a healthy part of your body's ecosystem. It's a healthy part of your relationship with land, this ground we walk on, your coworkers, strangers you meet at a conference, right? Conflict is this really, there's so much in it, right? And so when I think about the indigenous roots of restorative justice, it's not only asking us to uplift histories of colonialism and to uplift indigeneity, but it's also asking us to like really listen in, to actually say when we pay attention to conflict, when we pay attention to how it shows up in community, what might it be telling us? The second part of the definition is specifically like more of an organizational and institutional definition, and it's that restorative justice is an alternative to punitive practices, right? So whereas typically a lot of practices say that if you do this thing, you're removed from a space, maybe you're suspended from a space, maybe you're not allowed to come back to a space, you need to take time out of a space. Restorative justice really says we can come up with solutions together as a community, right? And that involves us being able to communicate and storytell and really open up to listening to one another. Now, when we talk about this typical language of like victim and perpetrator, victim and offender, that becomes difficult, right? It can become really difficult for a moment of violence, a moment of conflict to occur and say, okay, sit with one another and talk about it, right? And so I just want to name that in this idea of an alternative to punitive discipline, that's difficult work. It takes identifying what relationships already exist on all sides of conflict. It takes time really working to build and grow those relationships. And all of that has to happen before that moment of bringing people together. And so I want to say that it's an alternative to punitive discipline, and also it's a much slower process. It's a much more intimate process than our typical tools of being able to say, okay, you did this, you're out, work, right? It takes time, it takes relationship. The third piece of this definition is that it's a way to break binaries of good and bad and right and wrong, right? When I go back to this definition of conflict and how it shows up in laws and constitutions and zero tolerance policies, a lot of what that does is it continues to put humans into this binary of who is doing the right thing, who is doing the good thing, or who is doing the wrong thing, and who is doing the bad thing. What we really ask in restorative justice practice is what else exists, right? How else can we storytell about our experiences besides using that language? And what do we find when that happens? And this fourth part is that it is a practice where A, consequences exist, and B, nobody is disposable, right? And so it's not to say that restorative justice brings people together in circle for storytelling on what happened, what was experienced, and then that's that. It really brings people together to say, we have what we need here to decide what is next, right? And that can involve some pretty serious conversations around taking accountability, around listening to the way that you've impacted somebody, about listening to the way that you've been impacted, on deciding commitments that are coming next as accountability to those commitments, right? And so I really want to hold that it's not a practice that is void of accountability and responsibility and care. It actually is a really challenging route to be able to engage in that interpersonally. So, just said a lot. And would love to know if there are either things coming up in all of your minds as you heard some of this, or questions that are coming up, or pieces that you're sitting with. Yeah.
So I joined really quickly. My name's Raven. I work for PSA. But I came to this class. I don't know really much about restorative justice. I've always been interested. But as you were speaking and explaining the definition, I'm a mom. Positive redirection just kind of like came up to my head, and it's basically like, you know, when we discipline our children, we kind of like do something negative, or in that case, you know, just doing something positive and redirecting the situation. It kind of brought me to that with this, because like instead of taking a conflict or something that happened and, you know, coming with a different approach that could be a positive outcome rather than a negative consequence, is kind of like what I'm getting when I hear you speak about restorative justice.
Yeah, and that there's like an opportunity to like transform something, or grow it into something else.
Right.
Yeah, I'm Kathy. I'm also working for USA. I just, you know, like I'm so personally, on a very personal level, freaked out by conflict. I hate conflict. I don't want to deal with conflict. And I think as a nation, maybe as a world, that's sort of what it is. We are so afraid of conflict that it seems like to overcome that, to not be able to say, there's conflict here, you go away, and we don't want anything to do with you anymore because we can't deal with
Yeah, I think like a tip or recommendation that I have, and I think this will make more sense as we continue the conversation, but a lot of times like a point of panic in thinking of restorative justice work is to think of like the toughest context it can exist in. Right, and there's supportive housing spaces across New York City that we're currently having restorative justice conversations with. And one of the reminders is like, start where relationships are already built, right? Even if that's in your life outside of the context of work, start by thinking about how conflict shows up there, how accountability shows up there, or if conflict is a scary word, then how care even shows up there, right? How do we treat the people we love when something goes wrong? How do we treat the people we love when everything's going well, you know? And there's a lot to learn in the interpersonal as to like ways that we are able to move together at large. Yeah.
Listening to you speak about that makes me think about one of the challenges, I think, for restorative justice in any space really is that it depends upon a relationship. You know, you can't, it involves collaboration between all the people involved in the justice conversation and the process. It's not a one-way thing. And so thinking about, you know, I work in supportive housing and have for years and years, thinking about how to have those collaborative moments with various tenants, providers, you know, landlords, neighbors, etc. It's a community building activity without which we're, you know, as a prerequisite, but also perhaps as a side effect.
Yeah, and a lot of organizational work that we do, I know that I usually separate like restorative justice and restorative practices. And when I think of restorative justice, I think specifically of that process of like, how do we build accountability that actually transforms relationships in a space, that actually creates shifts in the space. Restorative practices for me are the larger day-to-day practices that are able to support that. All to say that like one way restorative practices can look is the restorative justice circle, is that conversation that's relationship-based. But there's also so many ways for us to just think of like, how do we redesign the day-to-day things, the day-to-day containers that we move in, work in, function in, to better support that kind of an environment. Cool, I see a bunch of hands. Let's go here, then back there.
Sure. So one of the things that I like about restorative justice is that sometimes it's a moving target, right? So it doesn't necessarily be like, at the end of the day, everybody's hugging and friends and everything is resolved and perfect, right? Like there's like a continuum, and you may not be able to get the point that you know, the perfect point where everything is kind of smooth and everybody comes together and it's perfect. But you can alter the direction that it goes so that it skews towards the positive anyway. And I think that's what, like, one of the things I think sometimes we get stuck on is that we always want to achieve that like perfect, oh, this is the balance, this is where it's going to wind up. But just the littlest change, I think, can have an enormous impact. And that's one of the things I like about it.
I was going to say that the way you describe it reminds me very much of the dialogic approach, where it's the dialogue that's really important, and not about trying to push a certain kind of agenda necessarily, but rather allowing people on all sides of an issue to have space to kind of speak their truth and hear each other. Dialogic practices are called social network meetings, and it sounds very much like that, where you try to bring just people together in this space just to be able to sort of hear each other, and then it's through that discussion, through that conflict, as you said, that gradually certain truths may begin to emerge.
Thanks for that.
Hi, so I've heard you use the term transform a couple times, and I'm involved in curriculum building for a transformative justice program, training program at my organization. I'm wondering if in this context you're using restorative justice and transformative justice interchangeably, or whether there's differences for you that you would elaborate on a little bit?
Yeah, totally. I mean, sorry, I look only to say that if you feel excited to
Yeah,
answer,
I mean, the way that I think about transformative justice and restorative justice is, for me, restorative justice has always taken place in an institution or in an organizational setting. So through the criminal legal system, through a school, through an organization, and transformative justice for me happens outside of any institution. So I know both Anooj and I work in the community with conflict, people who are experiencing conflict, and they could be folks that have experienced violence or just general not getting along or sexual harm, and they do not want to go to the criminal legal system. They're not going to call the police, they're not going to rely on these systems, and they want a facilitator to come facilitate that discussion and dialogue. And to me, that's transformative justice. And so that's people taking conflict into their own hands and not relying on so-called experts or law enforcement. And to me, is a truly abolitionist exercise and practice that it doesn't take place with anybody who's overseeing it or watching it or saying this is right, this is wrong, you failed, or you succeeded.
Yeah. I think like another like more like an ideology rooted way that I sometimes think about it is like so if transformative justice is specifically working with systems, then within those systems are also like racism, white supremacy, classism, homophobia, transphobia, you know? And so it's to say that like a lot of the interpersonal harm that humans experience in their relationships on a day-to-day basis are impacted by those ideological systems. And so to shift those systems is to shift the way that you and I experience harm. So that's how I think of transformative justice, as the systems around us are impacting the way that we simply show up at work together, show up in community together, show up in friendship together. Whereas restorative justice is more the interpersonal practice of how we move with that knowledge, or how we move through the conflicts that show up on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, I guess I think of like restorative justice as like something that sits like a smaller sect within larger like systems transformation. Yeah. Can I ask what the transformative justice space is that you work with?
Sure. So I work in a supportive housing setting, and then I'm actually doing a social work internship with the training department, and I'm hoping to create trainings and like a little learning circle for the workers, and then hopefully eventually for the participants as well, to transform how we're experiencing harm and conflict with one another. It's still taking shape. It's a pretty recent development.
Cool.
Nice.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. Any other thoughts that people want to share out? Yeah.
How do you talk about restorative justice in an institutional setting when in this country, you know, social workers talk about their people they help clients, or there's like a very hierarchical relationship. They're like a public workers, sometimes the people they talk to, they're like companies that are, you know, outsourced from the government, things like that. How do you professionalize that and make a more, you know, real conversation between two sides?
I can talk about that as far as my work goes. So it's definitely not, it's not hard, but it's not easy either. So I'll just go into my experience in restorative justice and bringing it to the criminal justice system work. So I started off with the first circle, which had to do with a gun trafficking charge, and we were trying to do all these things for sentencing, and we're like, yeah, let's ramp up whatever our client does. And so we thought we would have this restorative justice circle. I thought I got trained to do it. I thought I was going to have our client and his whole family meet with the prosecutor and the arresting officer, and like all these imaginary things that I thought were going to happen that didn't happen. And what happened was I sat with our client and his family, and they basically talked about how the criminal justice system had impacted their lives and their son's life. And it turned into a healing circle, so it wasn't really like somebody apologized and people came together, and we didn't have anything to say about taking accountability or anything like that. But that's when I really saw the healing aspect of a circle, or experienced it. And that was in 2014. And then thought that I would, bring this wonderful exercise and practice to my office, where people basically said, that's never gonna happen again. That's the only time you're gonna do it. Nobody's gonna listen to you. But knowing in my mind, like I'd done research, I was like, this is happening so many places. I don't know why you're poo-pooing it at this moment. But then went out into the community and started getting my own experience facilitating. And all those years, from 2014 to about 2019, was still trying to convince people and say, just sit in a circle and we'll experience it. You can see it's really hard to describe what happens in a circle unless you're sitting in a circle. Not that it's like completely magical, but it is wonderful. It's special, and so all the time, the way that we're describing restorative justice to you today, that's what we do. That's what I do with institutions who are asking about it, and it's the same way that news, especially in the criminal legal system, the non-binariness is very important for me to describe, and have been very transparent about that. I'm not coming to facilitate a circle where there's a perpetrator and a victim or a defender. Like, we are all people, and we're all going to be sitting in the circle. We all are coming to the circle as harmed people. We're all coming to the circle as people who've experienced harm and brought upon harm to other people. And we're going to talk about all that. Yes, we're being brought together in the penal legal system because somebody did something wrong and another person was impacted. We're going to talk about that too. But it's not going to be a situation where we're all targeting one person and saying how bad and wrong they are, what they have to do to make it right. That's generally how I talk about it. And I just want to be as transparent as possible as a facilitator, if that's what I bring. And so fast forward to 2019, and then my job, that opportunity did become available, where I work to have circles between people who cause real harm, cause death. And thankfully, I don't mean to minimize it, but thankfully, for me as a facilitator, those first few times, those circles were requested by the victim. And they who really wanted to meet with our client. One of them wanted to meet with our client to forgive them. The other folks wanted to meet with our client just to hear about what happened 20 years ago. So thankfully, I haven't really entered a circle where I have to do preparation in advance that convinces people to show up. So that's another aspect of restorative justice, is that nobody's being forced to be in a circle. If people don't want to come, then they don't come. We prepare people, we describe what it looks like, we talk about people's fears, we talk about their expectations, we talk about what challenges might come up. If I'm facilitating a circle around conflict, I'm going back and forth between people and saying, this person has this expectation, what do you think about that? So there's a lot of stuff and preparation that happens before a circle that has to do with conflict. Other circles that are more community building, we're talking about what the process is itself, how we're going to show up, what we want to talk about. But specifically with conflict, there's a lot of preparation that happens beforehand, and a lot of making sure that everybody is okay with being in the process all along the way. So with conflict circles, anybody can opt out at any time. They can opt out during the preparation, they can opt out in the actual circle. If there's going to be more than one circle, they can opt out after the first circle. All of those are built in actually with community agreements that happen before the circle, outside of the circle, and also while we're in the circle. And I'll talk about community agreements, which are very important to building the circle space. So as facilitators, sometimes we bring our own agreements. Like if we were going to have a big circle right now, Anooj and I would bring our own agreements for our circle, just because it can take a lot of time for people to come up with what the community agreements will be. And so the community agreements are developed by the participants and the facilitators, and they are values and physical agreements that we hold while we're in space together, and hopefully that we carry on outside of the time that we have together. They can always be changed or revisited as the process moves forward, as conflict may come up or disagreements may come up, or people just don't vibe with a certain agreement. But some of the typical community agreements that we bring or that people come up with are about confidentiality within the circle space itself, so not taking stories outside of a process. Speaking with I statements, sometimes people say, take a break if you want to. It can be from the most theoretical agreement of like, come with your best self or expect the best from people. Sometimes it's expect to not have closure, because it's not always where you were in a circle and everything's done and tied up with a bow at the end. And then sometimes they're very physical things, like yes, you can eat in the circle, yes, you can check your phone or not check your phone in a circle. So all of those are the agreements that we come up with together.
May I ask, are you working with incarcerated individuals, or it sounds like it's incarcerated individuals that you're working with in restorative justice?
It's both. Yeah. It's both. So I don't run circles in a prison or jail for people who are incarcerated. As my job as a public defender, if we are able to reach out to someone who's been impacted by our client, we will have a circle. That hasn't actually happened yet. The victims have reached out and wanted the process. So with both of those at my job, both folks were out. No, one person was incarcerated, but there were special permissions for the room we used. And that's what I say up front with that as well. Like, we're not gonna, it's gonna be in a room, we're all gonna be sitting together. There's not gonna be a guard in there, unless they wanna sit in a circle. And there's not gonna be, like, there's no handcuffs involved. We're all gonna be freely sitting in the circle together. And then I did a circle for the Manhattan DA, same thing, where it's just very transparent about what I expect as the facilitator and what I need from folks and asking what folks need from me. And so people can be incarcerated or not incarcerated, but while we're in the circle, it's not in a prison or jail. It's has been in a courthouse or some type of office.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we work, so we collaborate on restorative justice work, where we've been working for the past like handful of months, for example, on like a community-based accountability and response to harm process. And that's been iterative and with like one-on-one meetings to really like dive in with people around like the dynamics of what's coming up and accountability before even bringing people together. So we've been collaborating on this for months and are still impending the larger circle process where we're really going to work towards transforming harm. And also Vivianne and I work in different sectors. So after the few hands that just went up, we can start to kind of like talk about what restorative justice looks like specifically in different sectors of work. So whose hands were up in the back? Yeah.
I may be jumping the gun now that you said that. I apologize.
No worries.
So I just want to be a little bit more clear, or have more idea. Sorry, I answered my son. So I'm going to give an example, and then just to see if I'm like on the same page what you're explaining.
Cool.
Restorative justice one-on-one things. Okay, I had a incident where I had a client touch me inappropriately. Been knowing him for about 10 years, and it made me extremely uncomfortable because I see this behavior, like I see the potential to have this behavior, but it's never been happening to me. So what that did was, it did make me uncomfortable, it did damage the relationship. There was a mediation, just with that, okay, so me forgiving him and understanding the whole dynamic of it, would that be an example, like I said, I'm maybe jumping the gun, would that be an example of restorative justice one-on-one?
I mean, I think, I think there's questions that I have. I think one is like, how is forgiveness reached? I think I've seen like a handful of community restorative justice processes happen without the person who caused the harm naming what they did and being accountable for what they did. And so I think I have a question of like, was that like how is forgiveness reached, I think is a question. And then there's generally a question that I have is like, what's the expectation after forgiveness? I know like a typical thing that I do in Circle, and this is specifically response to harm work, right? I think both of us really focus a lot of our practice also on just building relationships and building community as a form of prevention. But I think like kind of a model of how we work in space together is I'll usually start off with accountability of like, can you name the things you are accountable for? Because I think we find that oftentimes if people don't feel like the hurt they are experiencing has been taken accountability for, it's a little bit difficult to engage in a conversation beyond that point. And so really saying like accountability as this first step, this dialogue around, okay, now that we're understanding what's happening, like what else is possible, what ideas are there for change, etc. And then the final part is really committing. So like, I know when I worked I was a restorative justice coordinator in public high schools for a few years, and after every process, we would close the circle with having people identify like a task they were going to do to better their relationship with themselves, better their relationship with those who are harmed, and better their relationships with the community. And so there would actually be things that said like, I understand you experienced this, and so I'm willing to take these steps to make things better. And for some people that can be for some people like that can be an exchange of forgiveness, and for some circles that can be like XYZ actions that are taken on. Is that helpful?
I
So-
is that the focus, or is the focus just in general, there was a conflict and get you guys on the same page for forgiveness or whatever the situation?
I think it's also situational, so it's going to depend on what you wanted in that moment and possibly what that other person wanted. And it depends on what both of you say. And I think the other part that makes a restorative process restorative, if other people are there also. So if you had come to us and said, hey, this happened and I would like a process with this person, we would ask you, first of all, we'd say sorry that happened to you. Are you okay? And then we would go into, you want to process with this person, do you want to bring somebody else with you from your organization, a support person to be in this space with you who also engages with this person or engages in your workplace that could benefit? We would ask the other person, the person who caused the harm, is there someone you want to bring in this space with you for support? Not to be your co-signer on whatever you did, but someone to be your support because it's going to maybe be difficult for you to hear that you caused harm. And how can this person support you in moving towards accountability? And all of those people get prepared for this process. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I start with one-on-ones before a community accountability process, it always starts with asking those who have been impacted, like, what do you need? Like, that's always a central question, and moving from listening into whatever that is. What I have found is rarely the need in that moment is, I need this person, I need to call the cops on this person, or I need this person in jail, or I need this person to leave this space. Usually it's I need healing, or I need to be able to go back home and feel safe. It's usually things like that. And so when we start with this question of, if you are experiencing harm, what do you need? It gives us something to move from that also is a lot more universal than how our punitive systems treat people. Because the other thing about our punitive systems is that they don't ask victims, they don't ask people who are experiencing harm, they don't ask survivors what they need. That's not a question when police arrive to a space, that's not a question that they're going to ask, right? Yeah. I know that there was also a hand in the back.
Yeah, I also don't want to jump ahead. But
No.
I'm trying to get a better understanding. I think I can see things from the organizing side. My background is in organizing, and I understand, especially youth organizing. I've worked with Make the Road and UIC, and what I'm trying to understand is the context of it in your position as a public defender. What part of the process is that? Because I know you're working within a system that exists, and what role does that play? I mean, I don't want to say use the word practical, because that seems it's you're trying to accomplish something that doesn't really help anyone. But what role does it play in your job when you're working with someone that is being represented by you? That's what I'm really interested in. How what role does that play other than community healing or community wellness? Practically, I'm trying to avoid that. But your job, what does that do? I've never understood that.
The word practical is a great word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want it to sound like you're doing it to defend the person you're representing and nothing else. I don't want to lead it in that direction, but I'm just curious as to where does this play? Because you have to fight for that. It seems like you have to struggle to get that recognized as something helpful. How does it play a role in your job?
So I'll say that it's a tension that's growing month by month of being a restorative practitioner and that job, because one of the dangers in bringing that into the penal legal system, and it's growing, DAs are interested in it for whatever, and I don't know, it's a conflict in my own mind of I know on a personal level with my clients who I know that they have gotten things out of it and a personal healing, and it's never, ever since that first circle, I've never done it for sentencing ever again, because you just can't, what's the point? I don't understand, it shouldn't be used in that way, and so I'm very clear in my office of don't ask me to do this for sentencing, because I'm not going to write something that's and they did this thing, it's not for that, it's for the people that are there to get something out of it. And then I'm also worried about DAs and courthouses, although they've been doing it for years, of doing it, because it does turn into this carrot and stick thing of like, do this and you'll get 10 years instead of 20. Do this and you'll get this instead of that. And so I have been clear with prosecutors and DAs now of like, who've asked me about the process. I'm not facilitating a process where there's a carrot and a stick. If you want to do this for all parties involved and everybody gets something out of it, that's great. But I would not suggest implementing it as a do this and you get that type of situation. So that's it's a constant thing that I'm always thinking about. I don't have an answer other than I think about that too. And I just try to be as responsible as possible and make sure that I'm not trying to, if a victim is asking for a process, that I'm not convincing anybody to do it. And being very clear of like, I am not convincing you, not even my client, to do this. I have no idea if it's gonna benefit you or not. This is what it looks like. This is what it can provide. You can talk to this person or not. But I'm here for you. I'm here for the process.
I mean,
Yeah.
can I ask a couple
Yeah.
more questions?
Mm-hmm.
So these are the questions that we were kind of going to root the next part of just talking about the like cross-sectoral work within the criminal, legal, and education context. But I guess the two questions are like, why do you think restorative justice in the criminal legal context matters, or like why is it important? Like why is that a place that you choose to spend your time?
So the other thing that I try to keep in my mind is an ultimate goal of eliminating the criminal justice system. I know might not happen in my lifetime, but as Anooj started, it's an indigenous practice. And a long time ago, people used to sit around and talk about when there's harm in a community or somebody has acted in a way that is not part of our community agreements, what do we do with that person? And it was done probably by elders in some communities, probably by different makeups of people in those times and days, and probably in still communities out there in the world. But here we have the penal legal system where there's a judge and there's a prosecutor and there's a public defender, and the client rarely speaks. It's just all these people. The victim rarely speaks. It's all these people that are just deciding based on whatever evidence, based on whatever paper trail there is, based on people arguing and talking about the law, about what to do with a person, about how to punish a person, basically. And so, what was the question?
The question was why do you want,
yes,
why the criminal legal context?
Ultimately, if I see it as replacing that system in some way. So I see if I can be in a process with one of my clients and a person who has been impacted by my client and get them talking about what they want, then that's the goal for me. And yes, the other things are going to happen. Court is going to happen. Punishments are going to happen from the penal legal system. But if I can get these folks to talk and talk about what they need from each other, that would be the goal for me in doing it within the criminal justice system. And so I can talk about two specific times. One of the most amazing times was with a man who was asking for the process to forgive our client. And he was a man who, the case was 4 soldiers died in Iraq and from a bomb. And it was known that our client really didn't do anything. The charge is called material support of ISIS. Our client really didn't do anything that made that bomb go off directly or indirectly, really. But anyway, so that was the case. And the father of one of the soldiers wanted to meet with our client to forgive him. And that's what his goal was. I went to the client and I said, this man wants to meet you to forgive you. And a lot of our conversation was about, why does he want to forgive me? Who is this person? What is this process? Why would I do it? And a lot of my conversation was, you don't have to. This is what it looks like. The man wants to forgive you. I don't know if you want to be forgiven. What would you want to happen? And our client just wanted to listen. And so that's what we came with, was forgiveness and wanting to listen. And we had this beautiful process where this man did forgive our client. In the circle were the 2 attorneys that I worked with, an investigator on the case, me, the father and his fiance, our client, and a victim outreach coordinator from the prosecutor's office. And we just sat in a circle with coffee. We had tea, we had coffee, we had donuts, and we talked about what happened. We talked about how people were impacted. We talked about my client being incarcerated and what that was like for him to be incarcerated for many, many years after that day. And then after that, I think the two men are in touch. They still write letters to each other. They're of different faiths, and they talk about what their faith is and what that means to each of them, what that means for going forward. And that, if there can be an outcome, which I try not to go in with, I want this goal, or I want this outcome, or I want these things to happen, that was the outcome of us talking in circle, and then these two men talking by themselves, and us witnessing that. And then another process was for the Manhattan DA, and that was from the son of a man who was killed by a client who was not my client, a person who was incarcerated. And this man also wanted to forgive this other person. And his reason was because his father would have wanted him to. His father would have wanted him to forgive. His father would have wanted him to engage in a restorative justice process because his father knew about restorative justice, and so that was his goal. And the client wanted to apologize. That was his goal. And I didn't know at the time, but the client had a sister, and so we involved the sister as well. So the sister was there and was able to talk about how she was impacted by her brother and also impacted by the case in general. And another beautiful moment where people came together and understood each other, understood what was going to happen next, made commitments to each other of how they were going to lead their lives going forward. And I also made a commitment to stay in touch with the incarcerated person and his sister as a community member. And so that's what I got out of it as well, is a new community to support.
Yeah, and to talk a little bit about the education justice context, restorative justice is like a growing practice across schools. And specifically, there's a larger movement in New York City for restorative justice in schools as a way to also be able to divest from over-policing and police presence in New York City schools. And so when we think about like the existence of the school-to-prison pipeline, if you are not familiar with that, it's both the implicit and explicit ways that our schooling system takes on characteristics, takes on the personality of our prison system, of carceral systems. That is racially correlated, is socioeconomically correlated, and tends to criminalize young people of color, young people with disabilities, young people living in poverty, young people who are queer and trans. Restorative justice we see as a tool to really be able to say from a young age that nobody is disposable, right? And to actually reevaluate schooling spaces as spaces not only of root learning and memorization, but spaces that can grow care, spaces that can grow community. And so a couple examples of what this looks like in the context of education. We use like this triangle when we're talking about RJ in schools. It's like a 60, 30, 10% triangle. We say 60% of the work should be community building. It should be bringing people together who are there day by day to just talk to each other about their experiences in the world, their experiences of being in school, their experiences as a young person, how they're impacted by the world around them. Just being able to talk, just being able to express themselves, just being able to humanize one another. 30% is the accountability work in response to harm and conflict. So circle processes that are actually addressing moments and incidents of harm or conflict. And then 10% reintegration. So this idea is that we hope that this 60% emphasis on community building is really able to build skills so that community is able to grow in a space that people are not actively being pushed out, right? But in the instances that they are, this other 10%, that soft spot is reserved for when people are coming back to a community after being out of it, to really say, how was that? What was that like for you? What do you need here? What are you committing to here? And so a couple of examples, I want to give one that's in the community building side and one that is in the response to harm side of restorative justice in schools. Is that a huge thing that we think about is just how agency impacts the conditions of community, agency impacts conditions of conflict. And so one of the things that we had really advocated for was to be able to have young people in each of the schools who were paid, which in this container of a world we are living in is can be a motivator, to be restorative justice advocates within their school, right? And what these young people in each of these 4 high schools that I was working in were really responsible for was thinking, what are the conversations that we need to have that aren't having? and hosting community spaces where people were really able to confront those things, were really able to hold those things together, were really able to talk about those things. And then after the first 2 years of that program, a wild thing started to happen where administrators and principals, when they saw conflicts happening between students, rather than them calling on teachers or guidance counselors, they started to call on those students. Because those students had relationships built with other students that dove deep into these conversations of like, well, how are you feeling? On a very human level, how are you feeling to have to be here every day? You know, and so the beautiful thing that had happened there is that our focus on community building shifted then so that these students, these young people, were the ones called on to respond to conflict when conflict was coming up in the building. Another example that's like directly related to like a response to harm or conflict is that there were these four young women who had gotten in a fight in the school building. And one day, their principal came up to me and gave them all their transfer paperwork. And she was like, you have one chance, you have one chance. Which again, this like dynamic that I am naming that like, I think that the challenge of restorative justice in any institution, be it criminal, legal, or the education system, is that sometimes it's used as like dangling a carrot in front of somebody, as in like, you gotta do this thing, or the bad thing is gonna happen, you know? And that for me is difficult because for me, a true accountability process is saying like, I want to continue to be in community and relationship with you. And that kind of sometimes blocks that from happening. But we had done a circle with these four young women. They each got to bring a friend, and there were a couple of their teachers and administrators. And we really dove into like the dynamics that had taken place over the years. And one of the young women in the circle, she said, I remember my first year here, and this was her junior year of high school. She looked at our assistant principal and she was like, I remember my first year being here, you had called me a bad kid, and I've never forgotten that. And she's like, and so I'm just a bad kid towards you. She's like, and I'm gonna keep being that. You know? And she had said that, and that opened up this like moment where everybody in the circle, all of the students were talking about the ways that they want to be seen, right? And it could have been really easy for that conversation to go in the direction of like everybody sharing these moments of like, yeah, well, this happened to me and this happened to me. But instead it was a moment of each person being like, this is actually how I want to be seen in this school. You know? This is how I would like to be acknowledged in this school. And it created this moment where like there was this communication opened up between administrators and students of like, okay, then like what if we tried to treat you like this? What if we tried to treat you the way that you're naming that you wanted to be treated, you know? And those four students were never, like the transfer paperwork was never submitted. It like created this whole new relationship dynamic between the administrators and these four young people. And so that's like a little bit about like how it can function in the education context, both as response to harm and preventative work, community building work. And so we'll pause there if there are any questions. And then after that, I think we want to switch gears into some smaller group conversations. So, are there any questions?
I have a question. How do you go about like bringing this into your own community? I've never, like I said, I live in Ulster County. It's rural upstate New York, and this isn't a thing that I've heard about. So, how do you like bring something? How do you shine light to this new movement in places that aren't practicing it?
Yeah. So one of like the things, I'm gonna answer with like a quick story, but one of the things that I think about a lot is the limitations of restorative justice when it sits within an institution, just because those institutions are also filled with punitive systems. So one of the things that a friend of mine and I collaborated to do was to find a community space and host just like an open restorative justice training. And it was just an open call to community members that described what it was, described what it could do, described that it was really about building stronger relationships in your community. And we just we gave like two options, an in-person option and an online option for people to come together and just be a part of this like day-long training. And it was really a day-long conversation. More so than a training, it was a day-long dialogue around restorative justice and restorative justice practices. And from there, we've built like a monthly cohort where all those people are invited back to say like, how are you seeing this in your life? Like, how are you seeing this day to day? Can we decide on something that we all want to go out and try? And then we come together and reconvene around whatever that thing is that we did the next month. And so really, like, one of the ways that we started it was just finding a community space and letting people know, like, we're interested in this, and if you are too, like, come talk with us. Come form this thing, and we can meet month by month. And really, those month-by-month meetings, the two questions are, like, how was it, that thing we tried, and where do we go next? You know? And it also builds a community of support, because the other thing is, like, this work has been really lonely, you know? Like, until I started this position that's, like, really about building a network of people who are all thinking about this together, like, I felt super alone working on this in schools for years. I felt super by myself. And so this idea of, like, having a community of people to continue to reflect with, it says like, I don't have to hold these questions that feel really lonely by myself. We can hold them together, right? And that's a huge dynamic in this work in general. Like, when I think about how people experience isolation in communities and exclusion in communities, it's often because they have to hold experience alone, they have to hold identity alone, they have to hold questions alone. And so the best way to engage in this work is by gathering people to be in dialogue, to think about things together, to hold things together. And there's a skill that develops there, you know, a very human skill, and a skill nevertheless. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Yeah. So we're going to ask that you try to turn towards 5 people or so that are near you, and you can move your chairs to make a mini circle, or you can kind of just arrange in a circle. And we're going to ask you to answer some questions together in circle.
Is it okay if we have 6 people?
Yes, oh my goodness. I saw in the back and I was like, I know her.
Okay, so once you get yourselves together, you can go in any order that you want, but go in an order of the circle. Try not to do a cross. Just go in a circle rotation. And here are the questions, okay? And you can answer all 3 together. You can take one at a time. But the questions are, what can RJ look like in the context of supportive housing? What challenges or tensions come up for you when you think about RJ in the supportive housing world? And what can we envision supportive housing to look like without intervention from a carceral system? So what can RJ look like in the context of supportive housing? What challenges or tensions come up for you when you think about restorative justice in this context of supportive housing? And what can we envision supportive housing to look like without intervention from a carceral system? And so if you just start with someone and go in whatever order, but go in a circle order, if that makes sense.
Can you say the first question again?
Yeah. What can RJ look like in the context of supportive housing? If there's word up here, I can type.
I love submitting invoices for people. is a big enough group that if we had time, we could do it. Yeah, that's true. No, it's kind of fun. I really wanted to do my program that I graduated from, but it's such a small program that
Cameron, I started classical.
I always have a really interesting interaction with Cameron. I think this is okay. Cameron doesn't know me very well in the academic things, and I'm Mika's assistant. And so all of the emails that I get from him are like, hey, can you check with Mika around this and this and this? Like it's like none of it indicates that he's aware that I'm making men that like has a practice.
I'm assistant. Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's also interesting. I don't know what's like going on with your
He's like one of your It always takes me. And before I drink
yours, it might be good.
And before I joined the Guevara group, apparently before I got brought in, they're very intentional people. Very intentional.
I was like, I get it. It's a way to feel like you're doing something in this class. Yeah, it's just like that. I love it. One of the high school. we had a group of students who I supervised in my first battle where I used to always carry them around. And on the last day, they got me established. It got really yummy. We wanted to make kazak, but then we didn't know, like, if we came here and we didn't want it, what we would do. I was like, I'm so glad you even got it dog.
But then, so I don't know if it will actually happen. However, what if, I'm going to ask them about if they said no, I'm like, okay, I think the paycheck stays the same. I don't know what they said my paycheck for a teacher.
Do you have any ideas?
No? Okay, I'm going to bring up that thing because I know because it's and then I think what happened with Safe was like, first it was me and Cameron. Then we added, it was always supposed to be one semester, then we added second semester with Cameron and Safe took it together. And then Cameron decided to be teaching the course and then Safe was her class. I had my own class. And then I don't know what happened to Safe, but then Greer started to teach that semester. So I don't know if Safe takes one semester and Greer takes another semester. I teach both semesters.
It's interesting that people we meet in our starts. I met Melissa early on, which is why she's such a good friend. She's like my go-to. Yeah.
I was going to share, I met Nico, who just reached out to me, like, she was trying to get together our JI, and I was like, I'm going to bring together Justice League and I'm talking about it. So that we had that. I said, we met, I said, I'm doing this. She was like, that's amazing. We have meetings in my office every month. And I was like, wow. So we had a part JI meeting every month. Just like you did. Except different people every time. Every meeting, we're like, it's not
I'll say 2 minutes. All right, we're going to come back together in about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Started with childhood.
Now I want to go.
Let me know what you have. I love it.
Any clothes, I guess?
Great.
So intimidated working with a theater person. We're like, I work in the wings.
Yeah,
Even though,
really,
you know, it's
I love doing producing meetings. I could do some stuff specifically with Oh, really? Make it happen.
I went to HB Studio. So I met a lifelong friend there. And I was doing ponies. I just moved here. I was like,
So we just wanted to open it up to everybody to ask, are there things that you talked about with any of these questions that really excited you that you want to share out about? Whether it's ideas, whether it's questions or tensions, whether it's possibilities, anything that folks want to share out.
Yeah. So for the first question, we were thinking of like different ways that RJ could work, and one of the ones that stood out for me was between the tenants and their neighbors. We have a lot of issues with so really quickly, our agency, the housing program I work for, it's not like a building, and everybody in there is in supportive housing. Our clients pick their own housing and sign their own leases, and we're just provide the support. Right. Yeah. Okay. So then, they have neighbors that they don't integrate with well, and I think something like this would be really good for those conflicts that occur.
Or even to build community when people first move in, just as like a who are you, Yeah. And I think about a function, it's interesting, like the deeper I get into this work, the more serious I take like roommate agreements, and like having conversations with my roommate and neighbors around like, if something happens, how do we respond? Like all of those are now just like conversations I have when moving into a place, and I wonder what some of those might look like in this context. Yeah. Other things, yeah.
In our conversation, one thing that we wondered about was how to address like in supported housing in a lease tenant situation. If you're doing restorative justice work, there is ultimately power differentials. You can't like totally neutralize them away, or how is that discussed, or how is that acknowledged?
Yeah. Would you like a?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Please solve that question.
Well, I mean, I think. Okay. So if we think of restorative justice as this dialogue that is able to like continue at any moment, a lot of the things we talk about are like, what are our experiences in the world around us? How are we impacted by them? How do we move from them? What else can exist? For me, all of those questions sit in this back and forth of there is a world as it is now and a world that we would like it to be. And I think for me, what I always sit in with the realities of hierarchy is that we have to hold both of those conversations. It has to include both an acknowledgement that I will always have a relationship with my boss that is a relationship with a boss, and also holding this desire to be able to think about, okay, what else could this look like? What else could this be? And so providing that like loop, right? Just providing space for that loop between this is the world as it is now and this is the world as we would like it. I think providing space for that dialogue to emerge is a start.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
I mean, I do this activity with a lot of organizations that has them name like the dynamics of their organization now as it is and the dynamics that they dream of. And then we do this activity called Take Down, Inspire, Exalt, where it's like to bridge that space in between. What would you remove from this space as is? What would you create? And what already exists that you would uplift or amplify? So that's like a more actionable version of like how that dialogue can be like, okay, let's make movements towards that thing we want. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the things that came up in our group that I thought was kind of an important thing to note was that obviously in supportive housing we have sometimes clients that have serious mental health issues and may not be well enough to participate in a restorative justice process. And it kind of goes into the like, they may want to, right? So that the desire is there, but in that moment they may need to get more stabilized in order to get everything they can out of the process. So
Yeah.
that was I guess one of the challenges. So it was more of a second question than the first one, but.
Yeah, and issues like that have come up when I've done the circles with the kind of legal system. When I was talking about the man whose father had died, the person who caused the harm did have some significant mental health issues and some cognitive delays, and he was able to participate. I mean, and I was clear with everyone. His lawyer was actually worried about him. His public defender was like, he has a very flat affect. This prosecutor is asking for meaningful involvement in the circle. I don't know what they're going to be looking for meaningful involvement. And so it was very clear with her and him and the prosecutor, meaningful involvement for this person means that he's sitting here today with us. It's not going to be big apology, tears, his face doesn't have to change. That he's here listening, that is enough.
I think with that, our group is discussing, like, as folks that are engaging in and providing something, like maybe zooming out and understanding what's important to the people that we're serving, and like it may not seem important to us, or it may seem like, you know, smaller arguments and tensions are things that can be worked through, but kind of meeting everybody where they are, and thinking about like just sitting with like what's really bothering you. I think that's the tension, but also like how you make it less of a carceral system overall.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One very concrete thing that we spoke about in terms of envisioning what it could look like, we talked about the fantasy idea of having like paid positions for service recipients in our housing programs to act as restorative justice ambassadors in the way that you described the school setting, and what that would take, right? Both like at a like structural funding level, but also in terms of like dealing with that when issues arose or whatever. But like if you could have like a support housing program with 200 tenants living there, like 4 or 5 ambassadors who had that as like a paid position.
And I think that's an ideal, like when I come into spaces, organizations who ask for a process, I always offer, does one or two people want to participate and shadow and learn how to do this, so you don't have to call an outside person every single time? These should be built in, and you don't have to call somebody in for that because you have these practices.
But also that there's potentially a need for some like fully outside facilitation in order to try to interrupt some of the power dynamics and differentials. And because in some cases, like some of the conflict is not just between the service recipients, but between service recipients and service providers. And then in order to have, you know.
That was a really good question, because my question was also, you know, a lot of them coming from different backgrounds, different programs and things like that. So my question was also, how do we use this? Because we don't have it in our program. We don't have the supported justice in our program. So how do we use this? How do you guys come out and train, or, you know?
Yeah. I mean, we weren't planning on giving a plug for Restorative Justice Initiative, but if you go to Restorative Justice Initiative, there's a directory of organizations and individuals who provide training and do this. There's also trainings in general that people have that you can sign up for and go to. In New York City, there's a ton of people that do this and can come in and train, come in and facilitate.
Can you
and
put
do
your
whatever.
contact info?
Yeah.
Contact information.
Yeah, a couple things. So how Restorative Justice Initiative works is that we're only a staff of 3, but we have a really close community of people exploring this work together, and facilitators and practitioners. And so Vivianne doesn't work for Restorative Justice Initiative, but is like one of our dearly trusted partners in thought. And so yes. Also, if you want to put my email, you can. It's just first name at restorative.justice.nyc. Yeah. Yeah, and so I'm super down to be a thought partner. If you're like, what does this look like in the context that I'm working in? I'm super open for that conversation. But also, like, if your organization has the capacity and like wants to bring on people to support in the integration of this work, that is a thing that we do. We pair people in our community of practice up with organizations and spaces who really want to push this forward, and see what emerges. So, thank you all. I realize we're going over time.